Imagine for a moment the status of Europe after the defeat of fascism in 1945. 6 years of carnage with the most advanced weapons conceived to date had left Europe in ruins. Towns were wiped off the map, and the political institutions of countries such as Italy, Germany, and France were devastated. In many ways, these countries, amongst others, had to begin from scratch. I'm your host David, and today we will be talking about how the West was rebuilt, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan. This is the Cold War. So one possible model they could look to was the country which gave more than its fair share and arguably sacrificed the most and contributed the most to the fall of the Nazi regime. I am of course talking about the Soviet Union. With many socialist currents in action before and during the war across the world, the vision of the Red Army marching into Berlin and destroying the symbols of the Nazis led many to think that their way was the future. Now, imagine you're the United States, the wealthiest country on Earth. By the end of the war, more than half of all industrial production on Earth was happening inside your borders. You won the war, you have a roaring economy, but you see a rising influence of socialism in Europe. How could you counter it? Well, the US decided to go a rather simple route. What if they just paid them? Now, to begin, let's go back to the video in this series on the ideological drives behind the Cold War. As I'm sure you recall, the liberal capitalist United States saw the opening of trade barriers and markets, especially to US companies, as the epitome of freedom. The United States would do a lot to make sure the countries wrecked from the Second World War, at least in Europe, came back online with big, strong economies full of big, healthy consumers as soon as possible. So why not give these countries a big shot of money to get them back on their feet? The US developed the first draft of this plan in June of 1947. They even offered to give some aid to their Soviet allies from the war, but these offers were turned down. Already, the wartime alliance had frayed between the two. Stalin, arguably correct, knew this money would come with strings attached. The Soviets forbid their allies and satellite states from partaking in the cash being offered. In 1948, President Truman signed into law the European Recovery Program. Today, we call it the Marshall Plan. By the time this program of aid would finish, the US would give 16 European countries more than $17 billion US. This might not sound like a lot, but once adjusted for inflation, this is something equal to $200 billion today. This plan tracks with the way the US at the time, with a Republican Congress and Democratic White House, saw economics. The predominant economic model believed that spending money in struggling economies could act as fuel to get the engine running again. But this wasn't without dissent. Some economists who believed in laissez-faire style of economics objected to giving massive subsidies. They believed it would keep these countries from abandoning what they saw as socialist policies. Laissez-faire economics is the belief an economy functions best when the state is involved with it as little as possible. Laissez-faire economics was an unpopular idea in the 1940s, with people blaming it for the Great Depression. But once we replace a few people on this portrait over here, it will get more popular. But let's rewind a little and talk about how such an ambitious economic project came into being. What effect did it have for Europe and the world? The destruction of the Second World War was particularly horrible. The continent itself is no stranger to war. Take a peek at our sister channel, Kings and Generals, for a minute to see for yourself. But this was a war of strategic bombing, the targeting of population centers, a war on infrastructure and industry. Europe was a mess, for lack of a better word. The US shipped trillions of calories of food into the continent to keep people from starving. Millions of Europeans were refugees. They lived in massive camps or wandered the continent looking for the basics to live. Unemployment skyrocketed, and even by the devising of the Marshall Plan in 1947, Europe was showing little sign of recovering. This was a situation ripe for strikes, for revolts, and with many thinking of 1917, revolution. To the US, the risk of socialist overthrow was large. America, by contrast, had barely been touched by the war. Aside from Pearl Harbor, attacks on some of their Pacific territories, including the Aleutians by the Japanese, and a strange failed plan where the Japanese tried to deliver bombs across the Pacific via balloons. Almost no fighting took place on American soil. The US economy also emerged from the war larger than it had ever been. The production requirements of the war brought the economy back to life after more than a decade of the Great Depression. Before the war, the US wasn't much of a global exporter, but now, well, there was an opportunity to find a lot of new markets, or make some. Getting Europe back on its feet was not only good for the US economy, but a matter of national security. They could bring back as much of Europe back from the encroachment of Soviet influence as possible. The Marshall Plan replaced something called the Morgenthau Plan, a mission in the immediate post-war period to destroy the capacity for Germany to rearm, elect more Nazis, and start the whole thing over again. The USSR argued for a much more brutal stripping of the German industrial base. By 1947, the US was coming around to the idea of proper reconstruction and, of course, clear denazification as the way to fix Germany. The Soviets and the Americans were at an impasse over their different goals for Germany, punitive versus restorative. The Soviets walked away from the table, rejecting all these new plans. Shortly after negotiations broke down, Marshall spoke about his plan to rebuild the economy of Europe. He cited it would contribute to political stability, an effort not for any particular state, but a mission to heal the wound of the Second World War and move on. This was the context in which Marshall offered a program of aid to rebuild Europe. Despite their walking away, in Marshall's speech, he invited the Soviets in the process. Whether this was an attempt to look the bigger country while trying to pay the Eastern Bloc out of being communist, well, that depends on how you want to read it. Stalin was a little tempted by the plan, but when he saw the aid had some strings attached, such as liberalizing trade and standards for currency exchange, he backed out. He already had worried that the US would use its massive capital to take over the industrial capacity of many small nations, and to him, this did nothing but confirm it. His outward concerns were about keeping these countries free from US capitalists, who would come and buy up the economic heart of independent states. But he also feared that this would put states out of the Soviet sphere. When invited to discuss the Marshall Plan, the Soviets not only did not attend, but barred other countries in their bloc from attending as well. So a bunch of meetings took place, an amount of aid was decided upon with the countries who did agree to it. The expenses were passed through Congress with little issue, save a few grumpy Republicans. Even in the Republican Party, these guys were in the minority. Congress passed the Marshall Plan and set up the Economic Cooperation Administration to, well, administer the aid. Now, with the descending of the Iron Curtain, some countries in Eastern Europe and Asia Minor were the most at risk of coming under Soviet influence. In Greece, a war between the king and communist forces was already underway. The first real public saber rattling in the Cold War was in service of increasing aid for the monarchist forces there. Nearby in Turkey, there was a standoff between the Turks and Soviets over giving the USSR access to the Turkish Straits. As a body of water which connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, I'm sure you can imagine the supreme strategic and economic stakes at play here for the Soviets. So the first places Marshall Plan aid arrived was in these two hotspots to counter Soviet influence. The funds made it to the rest of Europe, who then used said money, as the US intended, to buy American goods for reconstruction. So their loan went out of America and then came right back. That's not even mentioning that one out of every $20 for the Marshall Plan went to the obscure European nation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Wait, what? Yeah, in case there was any doubt this was a program to counter Soviet influence, the CIA got a lot of Marshall Plan money to infiltrate and disrupt socialist movements in the countries they were helping. You know, for freedom. So, did the Marshall Plan reinvigorate the European economy and stop the Soviets from taking over Europe and making a real-life version of the game Red Alert? Well, if you have a solid answer to that question, I would suggest you write it all down. It would be 1, a bestseller, and 2, likely get you many awards. Now, Europe did bounce back rather fast from the beginning of the plan up until the US stopped it in place of a much more critical economic venture, fighting in the Korean Peninsula. It did help immediately. Food was scarce and times were rough in Europe. But historians have been debating for decades over the extent Marshall Plan money helped with Europe's rapid recovery. The US and European countries had incentives to sell the program as working, both at home and in their partner nations. Historians are led to believe the effects were exaggerated. But there are other side effects which had massive impacts on Europe. The Commission started to deal with the recovery, often gets credit for putting Europe on the path to integration. This would eventually become the European Union. The stipulations about liberal markets and the overt and covert sabotage of socialist movements did keep communism out of Western Europe, especially in places such as Austria, which was largely surrounded by Eastern Bloc countries. Today, the Marshall Plan, much like the New Deal, is often used to refer to the government giving massive investment in building or rebuilding entire cities, countries, or even continents. So the cultural impact of the Marshall Plan can't be undersold. Also, like the New Deal, it was the high watermark of the Keynesian period of American economics, when the American way involved investing in economic ventures to get the economic machine running. This idea would come under fire and be overturned in the 1970s in favor of neoliberal economics. Europe and Japan are often held as examples of rebuilding nations after war, and cited as a comparison example to cases such as Iraq and Afghanistan. The last thing to mention is the Marshall Plan set the borders of the Cold War dynamic and laid the foundation for this climactic struggle for the fate of the world. We here at the Cold War will continue to discuss that struggle in our future videos, so make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.